Hello, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Clarissa Morosky with the Reloop platform, and today we're going to talk about some elements of the international legally binding instrument on plastics pollution. I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Dominic Hogg, who has been working with Reloop since before INC2, so that we can have an informed voice within the total INC process. Reloop is an accredited NGO under UNEP.
Hi, Clarissa. It's great to be here.
So let's talk a little bit more about extended producer responsibility. It is another paper that we put out for the INC3 process. And extended producer responsibility, which has been around for a long time, particularly in Europe and in Canada, is a very, very complex model, as you well know. And our paper sort of looks at a more simplified perspective of EPR and addresses some of the challenges faced by countries with minimal waste management infrastructure. I wonder if you can talk about that a little bit, and what benefits do you see in this sort of simplified approach compared to more complex EPR systems, and particularly in less developed countries where they don't have that capacity institutionally or the infrastructure-wise?
Yes. Well, I suppose in this instrument, as it may come forward, my main interest as regards extended producer responsibility, and I think the instrument's main interest, should be not on countries who might be doing a reasonable amount of recycling today or have decent waste collection systems or whatever. I'm mainly interested in what looked like being something like 2.8 billion people on the planet without a meaningful waste collection as of 2016. I can't imagine it's a huge, that we've seen a huge reduction since then. But there are a very, very large number of people on the planet who essentially have no waste collection. Now, why don't they have it? Implementation gap. Here we see it in writ large. So a country can say, hey, we're going to do X% recycling. And they can say, right, we're going to require every local authority in the country to do X, Y, Z. And then there's no money. And so where do you get the money? Where do you get the money to do this? And so the local mayor is sort of sitting there thinking, hey, I've got an election coming up. I could put in place this new service, but I suspect that if I do that, I'm going to have to put in place a new local tax or increase the local tax or fees or whatever, unless, of course, the central government decides to step in and provide some of the funding and so forth. How do we unblock this? And so for me, extended producer responsibility has a role to play here. And let's go back to what is it we're extending the responsibility of the producers to do under extended producer responsibility? Is it design? Well, they already have a bit of influence over that. They're buying the packaging, or they're sometimes making the packaging, depending on how you define the producer. So they already have responsibility for the design. Is it the recycling? Maybe, yeah, might be, because let's face it, if there's no collection service there, nothing gets recycled, does it? Although, clearly the informal sector, where it's active, targeting particular materials, will potentially recycle some of those at quite high rates. But in the round, the thing we want them to do fundamentally is to fund the management of the stuff that they're putting on the market at the end of its life. Now, do I care what form the way in which they do that should take? Well, I suppose my simple view of the world is, yes, we would like the harmonization in principle across the ways in which people do this. In practice, that harmonization might be more difficult to get in terms of the way in which people choose to implement that objective of making producers responsible for funding stuff at the end of its life. I've seen some pretty indifferent attempts to do that. And so I suppose I go back to first principle and say, well, look, let's just try and make sure we can recover the costs of a decent waste collection and management service. And I think that should be it. I don't think we should be too worried about lots of other stuff that may or may not come into a form of extended producer responsibility. And the zero draft's talking about putting in an annex modalities as to how people might do this. And they're including things like modulation of fees, which, to be honest, we're sort of in the foothills of still. And I would much rather people didn't get too worried about that, where they've got no waste collection system currently in place. I much prefer that they got some money in and then it went to support the delivery of those services. If it happens to be in the form that some people describe as extended producer responsibility, whatever their definition is, fine. I have a very simple view of it, though, in the context of this instrument, and it's that the extension of the producer's responsibility is principally to the funding of the service at the end of life. And if I might, there are some really good examples of where countries, what they do is they're basically essentially just taking the money in from the producers and it goes out to support the municipalities. What's wrong with that? Would that be a terrible thing for this instrument to do? You'd have supported the funding of the implementation of the measures. You don't need to set all these targets within a EPR law. You may want to set targets for recycling, but you don't have to do it in the law regarding something called extended producer responsibility. And similarly, you may well be wanting to, and I would advise countries to articulate a sort of minimum standard of that service in terms of collection. And I wouldn't specify it in terms of, oh, you need this vehicle and this truck, and I would specify it in terms of how is it perceived, as it were, by the person who's in receipt of that service. And it should be convenient for them to use, and preferably it should be nudging them towards using the services for the recycling rather than chucking the stuff into residual waste. Not that we can't do some sorting with that, but that's what I think countries should focus on doing. And I hope that in doing that, we'd unlock what I still see as one of the key issues here, which is this issue of where does a local government official, mayor, whatever, where do they get the money to do this in such a way that they don't feel it's going to see them voted out of office 2 days later, having announced the fees that are going to be increased.
So in a way, that really calls for the need for this instrument to address at a minimum level extended producer responsibility so that we can cover those costs of collection, recycling, treatment, et cetera, to help that mayor so that he doesn't have to make the uncomfortable decision, a political decision, that it's just a decision of complying with the international instrument. It takes us to the end of our blogcast on these very important issues facing INC3 and also moving into INC4. Thank you very much, Dominic.
Thanks, Clarissa. And hope everyone manages to derive some sense from what we've been discussing. And good luck to all the delegates in Nairobi. It's a really important meeting.